Hi, everyone. My name is Bridget Colling. I'm with C3 Communications, and I am joined by Desiree Adaway today of the Adaway Group. And we are so excited to talk to you all about creating inclusion strategies. This session is specifically geared towards nonprofits and social causes and organizations or smaller businesses who are looking to implement strategies to develop inclusion and diversity within their organizations. And what I'm really looking forward to hearing about from Desiree in this webinar, and what we're going to be discussing in this webinar series, we actually have 2 more webinars coming up that focus on the topic of diversity and inclusion, is about why that word diversity is a tricky one, and why inclusion is so important. And Desiree is a total expert in this subject, and we're really, really lucky to have her here today speaking with all of us. So Desiree, I'll let you say a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me to join you and talk about this today. It's one of my favorite subjects, and I can talk about it all day long, but we're going to make sure that we leave time for questions and answers at the end, and ways that we can continue this conversation beyond today. But I am Desiree Adaway. I am founder of the Adaway Group, and I guess the easiest and simplest way to talk about what I do is I help organizations have difficult conversations. And a lot of those organizations are having these conversations, and they're based around race, class, and gender. And one of the ways I always describe the work that I do is I'm the person that you hire to come in and have the difficult conversation that you probably should have had 10 years ago, that can help change your culture, probably help save you money, resources, and your reputation. So I love what I do, and I actually, Bridget and I were talking, and I was telling her how much I actually really don't like the word diversity. And so I'd like to kind of kick it off by giving some kind of basis for that. That's kind of the foundation of what we're going to be talking about today. And so over my career, I've had many situations where I was the only woman, the only Black woman, the only person of color. I was the only person that came from a working class background. And I don't know if you guys understand how awful that is sometimes. To know when you speak that people are thinking that you're speaking for an entire community or race of people. And there was a lot of pressure there. I was never really allowed to make mistakes. I was being judged by a lot of different standards, and it was utterly exhausting. And it also was the reason why I ended up leaving some great organizations. It was too much. So my work over the past few years have been really focused on helping institutions. And let's be clear, the majority of these institutions are founded, shaped, owned, and dominated by white men or women. And my work has really been to help create more welcoming and supportive work environments for everyone, especially people of color, women, and most recently our LGBTQ and disability communities, brothers and sisters as well. So it's really, really important that we not just think about diversity as a code word for Black, which a lot in the nonprofit field do. When folks say they want more diversity, sometimes they're saying they want more visibly diverse people. And we want to really think about what does it mean to create a diverse organization and why? Well, why? That's really simple in a lot of ways. Some people are compelled by gaining access to different markets, and some honestly want to get access to new funders and partners. But the research shows this, that in an organization, if you want to be sustainable and at all relevant moving forward, doing equity and inclusion work is really not an optional for you, it's essential. So when you think of the term diversity, and you'll see up on the screen, it's that wide range of national, ethnic, racial backgrounds. But the way we talk about it within organizations is it is about numbers. So diversity can feel like it's about increasing representation, but it has very little to do with changing institutional cultures. And diversity is about quantity, and it has nothing to do with shared power and creating welcoming organizations. So if you hit the next slide, Bridget, you'll see we talk about what inclusion looks like. So inclusion brings the perspective and contributions of people to the table. It's about distributing power equitably, incorporating needs and assets and perspectives. Right? You use inclusion when you're designing and implementing process, policies, activities, and decision making. Okay. So again, I said it before, but I just want to emphasize this. If organizations want to be relevant and sustainable moving forward, if you are creating an organization for the future, then this work is not optional, it's essential. Right? So what drives people out the door? In 2007, Giving Notice did research, and this is what they came up with. It's not the headline-grabbing incidents, right, that drives most people of color or LGBT folks out the door. It is that day-to-day enduring micro insults against them. It is constantly being the only one in the room. It is that last slight too many. Right? And even if they don't say this to the HR director as they're leaving, this is the reason that people leave. Next slide, please. So there are different ways that you want to think about diversity, right? And here are some, and there are probably some that you thought of and some that you have not. But organizations unconsciously use characteristics as their norms and standards that can make it difficult, if not impossible, to open the doors for other cultural norms and standards to come through. Next slide, please. Right. So when you are thinking about hiring, you want diverse and qualified staff. You want a talent pipeline, right? You want to make sure you're meeting all your societal and organizational goals, and you want to be really putting forth a strong organization by bringing in skills and perspectives that are ultimately going to strengthen the organization and the work that you do, making you relevant and sustainable in the future. Next slide. What a candidate is looking for: a place where they can use their skills and grow, a place that shows where there's an open commitment to diversity, where you see it on every level, from leadership to stakeholders to staffing. And they also want to see the subtle cues that your organization understands this, right? And we're going to talk about what some of those are. So many nonprofits want to be multicultural, but we really only allow other people and cultures to come in if they adapt or conform to all already consisting cultural norms. And every time you say you want to find a new hire that's a cultural fit, what you're saying is, I really want folks that act or look like me and will not cause me any problems. Next slide. Right? So how does this kind of show itself? What does the good fit look like? I know that there's a chat box, and so I want, if you are brave enough, if you use the word you want a cultural fit in hiring in your organization, you can just say yes or no. If you've ever heard that used as you are looking to hire within your organization.
So I see one brave person saying yes. Yep, seeing another yep.
And more yeses?
Come in, yep. Yeah. Lots of yeses coming in right now.
Okay. So,
oh man, a ton of them. Yes, I've heard it. We do. Okay, we try not to, but it is said. Yep. I've also heard the term good fit for us. Mm-hmm. Some people aren't sure.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, it's very normal. It is what we do, right? We want people who will fit in, right? Who we think will feel comfortable. But we want to think about, when is being different bad and when is it just being different? And what are the results that you're ultimately trying to get to, and are there different paths to get there?
And Desiree, when you pose the question, when is being different bad and when is it just different, and maybe you're going to go into this in the next few slides too, but how do you, when you're working with organizations, help them make those determinations? Because I think for a lot of people, yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No. We are going to get into that. And one of the examples that I use is, do we always need linear thinkers? Right? Because having linear thinkers is usually what people are looking for. But is that bad, or is it just different? And what are we missing by having, the majority of thinkers within our organization be linear? Right? So, ways that being different can be equated with being bad. So we all have these structures built within our cultures. Our cultures come from the structures that we have. And so there are ways that being different can be equated with being bad. And these are these subtle and unsubtle cues that happen within organizations. That making a mistake, sometimes we confuse making a mistake with being a mistake. And I've worked in organizations where you are only, and these are nonprofits, I've worked in for-profits, these are nonprofits, you are only as good as your last project. And if that project was awesome, you're awesome. If that project was not so awesome, you're not so awesome. Right? Sometimes we equate raising difficult issues with being impolite, rude, or out of line. If someone pushes back on work, or on the way that a program is being handled, or the way that a relationship is being built with a community, are we really listening to the issues, or are we actually scapegoating the person that's bringing it to us? Sometimes we put so much emphasis on being polite. I'm not saying being in people that are in any kind of physical danger or harm, but just being polite so that things are not said. Does that make sense, Bridget? All of these?
I would love to hear you expand on it, actually.
So, I've worked for an organization that was Christian-based at one point. And we had folks who were doing work that they were actually not really good at, was over their head, and they were in the wrong roles. But the culture was they were good Christians. So no one wanted to have these really difficult conversations.
And we see someone adding in the chat right now, too. She says, as a woman of color in a mostly white workplace, I've come across the first 3 points. So thank you for sharing that. And if other people have questions or just want to sound off and share your experiences as well, please share those questions and I'll raise those with the group.
Yeah, would love to have folks share. Okay. So if you want to go back a little bit. So the next slide, please.
Yep.
Ways that different can be bad for teams. We want strong documentation and writing skills. They are really highly valued within a lot of organizations. To the point they're valued, I think, more so than people at times. So do we want people that can write? and really can't relate to others, or what do we value? Is the ability to relate our mission to the work and to the people that we're working with, is that valued as much as writing skills? Impatience with any thinking that does not appear logical is another way. And this is in part because we don't build time into our projects, and that's for lots of reasons. Funders, the urgency of the work we're doing. But little time and energy or money is sometimes put into reflection or really built into projects so that we can take our time and think about the choices that we're making. And so this is about how we're structured, how we do our work. What do we value as an organization? Do we value bigger and more? Do we value faster and quicker? Right. So Bridget, can I ask you about some of the work that you guys have been doing within your company? Do any of these past two slides, do any of these kind of
yeah, they resonate with me.
Show up in your work?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so this webinar, the webinar series that we're doing is part of the work that C3 has been doing as a company to really make a stronger, stronger commitment as an organization to diversity and inclusion. Excuse me, so sorry. We are a very white company, and we still are. And we've been working on really reframing, particularly our hiring and recruitment practices, so that we're really putting people of color at the center of those practices, and people from other groups that aren't well represented within our organization. And that's been both challenging and really rewarding. And I think something that Desiree said earlier that really resonated with us is just talking about that good culture fit, because that was definitely a term that we used, that we had used a lot in the past, and had also really praised job descriptions that we saw written from other companies, other social good agencies that seem to celebrate that culture fit. I can think of one anecdote in particular where we were passing on this job description that a few people on my team really liked, and I thought it was cute and well written. But the description of the team was, you love doing, you're a good fit for this team if you love doing yoga and listening to the Pixies, and you like hanging out with a bunch of vegetarians. And I was reading that, and I was like, man, this really sounds like a bunch of white people. And I think that there's sometimes ways that we signal to people who are either reading job descriptions or even when you're looking at, if people are looking at the team page on your website and all they can see are white faces, and particularly if they don't see white people in leadership positions in your organization, if they only see white people in leadership positions in your organization, and it's clear to them that there's not people of color in those positions, and there hasn't been this path for people of color in the past to really move up in the organization. I think that those are all signals to that, in thinking about people of color in particular, signals to people of color that this is not an organization where there are a lot of people who are going to look like me. And like Desiree said earlier, I think that can lead to people feeling very isolated if they do join this team. And I think, looking at this slide in particular, really valuing lived experience, I think that's something that we don't include enough in our hiring and recruitment practices. And it's so important. If you look at a lot of, especially, we're a marketing agency, and if you look at a lot of the blunders that are made by marketing companies, it's usually because people don't have diverse teams, I think, more often than not. And they don't have people in the room to say, sorry, Desiree, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say they don't have diverse teams. They also don't have people in the room, but then the people in the room don't feel like they have the power to veto things that are about to go out.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they're a single.
So they may have one or two people on the team, but they don't. It's not a culture where you can actually say to your boss's boss, I don't really think that's a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, someone shared here in the questions that we definitely value writing and smarts over interpersonal skills. I'd love to hear from other people on the webinar if there's anything here that's resonating with you a lot, or things that you feel like your team has learned, or things you have questions about. One question I see is, can you give me powerful language that will help me articulate the benefit of quote unquote diversity in the workplace?
Well, again, I don't know if we want to talk about diversity in the workplace, but what you want to talk about is that for the country's changing, the demographics of who we are is changing. And for our work, our messaging to be relevant and for us to be sustainable, we actually need to be more inclusive, and we need to have stronger relationships with a lot of different communities. And we all know, the research shows that by being as inclusive as possible during all parts of a decision-making process, as well as a production process, what you get ultimately is a better, stronger product. Right? So you want to talk about it not in terms of getting your card punched, but you want to talk about the business case of why this is critical and why you won't be here 10 years from now if you don't do this work today.
And I can say from C3's perspective, I think we're already seeing that from us, and on the client side, still being a very predominantly white organization. A lot of times when we submit proposals, all of the faces on the project team section are white. And when you look at our team page on our website, it's a lot of white people. And we have had clients ask us, I want to reach, young millennials of color. How is your team going to help me do that if you don't have any of these perspectives on your team? And that's a challenging question for us to answer. And I'm really glad that people are asking that question. I think we're going to continue to see more and more nonprofits, social causes, businesses, individuals demanding that there's some diverse perspectives on project teams. And
you're going to lose out on funders.
Yeah.
You will have funders who will come in and say, I don't see where your board is reflective of the people you're serving. I don't see where you have the relationships and to these are the areas, or you have really an engagement strategy around some key constituents. And so because of that, no, you don't have access to funding or resources or certain areas, and then your organization loses.
Mm-hmm. Someone shared an interesting analogy that I feel like builds off what you were saying earlier, Desiree. She said, in physics, there are certain math and individual research skills like faster and quicker publishing or harsh ways of critiquing each other. It sounds like that are valued over interpersonal and communication skills or soft skills. And she said this leads to terrible group dynamics because faculty have no training. So it sounds like a similar analogy to, what's valued versus what you really need.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But there is, and this is Western culture, but it's definitely within, I've been in nonprofits for 30 years, and I remember very clearly when it was, we must run a nonprofit like a for-profit, right? Like that whole mindset came into being, which has a lot of value. But we also brought in, I think, some pieces that don't really serve us well, and this continued sense of urgency that makes it difficult to take the time to be inclusive, to encourage democratic and thoughtful decision making, to consider long-term consequences. We don't have that in a lot of nonprofits, and it hurts us in the long run.
Absolutely. I think I see one more question here, and I think this is something you're going to touch on later as well, but just wanted to raise it. Someone mentioned there have been lots of studies that show that there are kinds of cues that keep certain people away from positions that happen even before you see their face. It happens when you read their resume. So how do we recognize and overcome that often unintentional bias?
Yeah, there are processes and systems that you can do blind resumes. I actually have led a an organization that I work with, and the system is you apply for a job. You don't send a resume in until about the third or fourth step. The first step is you just literally call and leave a voicemail message and answer 3 questions about yourself and about the job. The next phase is then there is a 20-minute phone conversation where you kind of think about big bucket skill set. The third stage is, a Skype interview. And it's only at the fourth stage, which can be a combination of writing, that you may say, hey, can you submit your resume? So up until that point, we really focused on the skills that person is bringing, looking at the job that we're hiring for. I don't know their I don't know their address. I don't know what school they went to. I don't know what part of town they live in. All of the things that our personal biases step up and get in the way. And I will tell you this, as a Black woman, my children have very, very, I name them very androgynous and what would probably be considered white names very intentionally. I have a Jordan Renee Dinwiddie. I have an Adriana Taylor Dinwiddie. And they are those names because I didn't want anybody looking at their resume and making a decision about them.
That's really powerful to hear in your own experience.
Yeah. If you want to hit the next slide.
Yeah, I have one more question just building off of that. I'm assuming that a lot of people on this webinar are probably wanting their organizations to actively hire more people of color. So is there does that work in reverse? If an organization is trying to hire more people of color and they aren't doing the blind resume and are kind of screening towards, if we see a name that looks like it might be a person of color, then we're more likely to interview them. Have you seen it work that way in organizations? Do you feel like it does work that way?
I have.
Do you feel like the blind resume is the way to go regardless?
Yeah. So I think you'll know usually by the time you get to the third step in that process, if your race and ethnicity and some of these other things, because it may be a face-to-face Skype, a Skype or a Google Plus interview. But it doesn't matter who you're hiring. You want to make sure that you're hiring people who are capable and competent of doing the job. And you don't want to move someone along the process if they are not capable of doing that. If they are capable and, it's a value of you and they are 85% or 90% there, then I think you do kind of say, hey, are we willing to invest the other 10% to make sure that we're bringing this person up to speed and we're preparing them for success within these roles. And that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to just make sure that you have a pipeline in place, that you've built the relationships with the communities that you need, so that you are getting enough of the diversity actually coming through the hiring process. And the other thing that I'd love that universities do that nonprofits don't do is a university will call a failed search in a minute, and they will say, nope, not enough of what we're looking for. Go out and start the process again. And this goes back to our sense of urgency. We think we can never call a failed search. We're all so overworked, and it's all so much. We are. But if this is important to us, if this is of a value, if this is the only way we're ever going to change it, then that's what we do. We invest the time and energy into it to do it right.
I just want to let everyone know I'm seeing a ton of amazing questions and comments coming in. I'm going to let Desiree get through a few more slides of this really fantastic content, but please keep leaving your questions and comments and things.
Thanks. So ways that this may show up in leadership, right? Again, talking about the sense of urgency that makes it difficult for us to be inclusive. Little, if any, value around sharing power. I think that we build allies, or we try to build allies, but we want to get highly visible results, and we want to take all the pictures with certain communities and win victories with them, but not build real relationships. And I talk about relationships that you build should always be transformational and not just transactional. Sometimes we have leadership that thinks power is limited. It should only stay in a certain level and above. And then we work with funders that reinforce all of these things to us, that will work a whole lot for a whole little money and have all these expectations. And again, that plays into this sense of urgency where we never get to take the time to make sure that we are being inclusive and encouraging democratic and thoughtful decision making. Next slide. So let's do a pulse check. Over the past couple of slides, where have you seen your orgs reflected? Maybe it's in some ways leadership. It's showing up in leadership. Maybe it's showing up in your recruitment. Maybe it's showing up in how your teams are built. Maybe it's showing up in your valuing writing over relationships. But so just do a pulse check, use the chat box and let us know where you see your organization reflected. And then what is your organization losing? And what will you lose if you don't really step into this space now and understand the importance of equity and inclusion within your culture and within your organization? And I can't see them, Bridget, so you're going to have to read some of it. You're going to have to read them.
Yes. Someone responded that leadership is less responsive to these issues than core staff, which I think is something that a lot of, I'm sure there are many people on this webinar who are struggling with that in their own organizations. So what do you recommend to organizations where leaders are not on board? Do you feel like this change can still happen, or does it need to come from the leadership level down?
I always work with, I think it can be a combination of both. I think it's probably some external forces, right? It is some changes in the environment, it's some changes, it's some emergency that happens externally, it's an opportunity for funding or growth that may push it and make the leadership pay attention. I also think I do a lot of conversations with leadership on this. How are you integrating this into your overall strategic plan with boards? Why is this important? And for me, with leaders, it always comes down to laying out the business case of why this needs to happen now. And it is doing our own self-awareness work, which is why I love what, Bridget, what you guys are doing, is that as a company, you're having these really important conversations on every level with everybody, so that the leadership is beginning to hear more and more just really how critical and important this is for them. If you don't know, you don't act.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And even though we're having those conversations, and I think our leadership at C3 has always been excited about our diversity and inclusion strategy. But I remember when I initially raised this as something that we really needed to address as a company, there definitely was some hesitation around particularly the issue of making room at the top for us as an organization to hire people of color in the top levels of leadership in our organization, because I think for a lot of small businesses or nonprofits, that means positions that you don't have money to pay for at this moment. And that feels really scary to the people who are cutting checks in your organization. But I think just stating that as a goal is really important. And it doesn't have to be something that happens tomorrow or even, in the next 6 to 12 months, but I think it needs to be a goal. It needs to happen sooner rather than later. And that to me feels like, just going back to what you were saying, Desiree, about how that comes out in leadership. I just felt like I saw that really clearly. And someone here just saying, what is your organization losing by not doing this work? I like this a lot. She said, there's plenty of research that says that more diverse groups come up with innovative, brilliant ideas, and we're missing opportunities to be brilliant.
Yeah, and relevant, and to actually do really good life-changing work. right?
Mm-hmm.
You've done excellent work, but that lasts so long. What does your work look like in the next 20 years, the next 30 years?
Mm-hmm.
Will you even be here? Will people remember your name? I think there's a lot of either and thinking in leadership sometime around this. That things are either, things are good, so why change them?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And really it's both and. Things are good here and things can get better. We're doing excellent work, but we can be doing brilliant work. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that either or thinking keeps things at the status quo. We won't change. Organizations won't change with it.
Mm-hmm. And what do you say to organizations? I've seen several people say, one of the things that they're seeing reflected in their organizations is that they hire quickly and they don't hire for value. And I think a lot of times that has to do with feeling like you just don't have the resources to really invest in more thorough recruitment. So what do you recommend to organizations who are feeling that pressure?
Well, I think it comes down to, do you want quantity over quality? Little or no value can be attached to the process. So it's, what do we value? What do we measure? And for a lot of organizations, all resources are directed towards producing measurable goals. And making sure that our organization has value statements which we express and that we actually live in our day-to-day work, making sure that it's a living document that is relevant to the people who are working there is really important. Making sure that we look for ways to measure, recognizing that it's not always about measurable goals, right? But sometimes it's just a long-term investment in areas. It's really thinking about ways in which you want to do your work as a, the culture of doing your work. Any other comments in the chat box?
There are a bunch. So many good comments. So someone said that their leadership's 100% on board and they're really proactive about seeking out minority candidates but still having trouble. So they want to know what your most advanced strategies are to help them move forward.
Well, they're talking about building relationships and building out the pipeline strategy, right? So if you're only recruiting at university, if you don't have a relationship with universities, HBCUs, if you don't invest in communities, right? So I know folks that they invest in do programming in housing communities or in communities that are or in areas where they're trying to connect with a certain constituent. And they start off slow, right? They start off by being boards in those communities, being connected to community activities. Again, this is a long-term play, and we want instant solutions, and you don't get instant friendships or instant relationships.
Yeah, and I would add on to that as well. And this has less to do with recruitment and more about dismantling systemic racism within your organization, which I think probably all organizations have some systemic racism in them, or a lot of them, I would guess. And I think something that we've done at C3 that has felt really powerful is dedicating staff meeting time to talking about race and racism. And we actually started out reading, and we can include these in the notes. And if you read our blog post directed you to this webinar, we included them in that blog post. One thing that we read as a team was called The Backpack of White Privilege by Peggy McIntosh. And it just talks about white privilege and how it's a white woman going through all of the privileges that she gets just from the color of her skin. And it ranges from things like going to a store and not knowing that she won't be followed around, or knowing if she has to speak to a manager, that manager will likely be the same color of skin as her, to things as simple as, when I buy toys for my kids or I buy Band-Aids, I can trust that the skin color will probably look just like hers, which is really powerful for us to read as a team and discuss as a team. And we also read something a bit more advanced. It's a toolkit and guide on dismantling racism within organizations. And it's like a 70-page book that has a lot of really great stuff. Just the background on race and racism within organizations, and how organizations can effectively work to dismantle it in day-to-day practices. And both those readings, doing those readings and then discussing them as a group, I think helped us transform as individuals. And I think that that's what organizations really need to invest in if they're really looking to build more inclusive teams for the long term, is actually doing more of that work that's about organizational psychology and organizational change, rather than just hiring and recruitment.
Absolutely. And one of the things that one of my clients did, and I just happened to be on site doing some work with them, it was after the Trayvon Martin, after the judgment came down, they actually had a staff meeting and they canceled talking about business, and they talked about, and we processed that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We processed what that meant for the brown people in the room to come to work and have to deal with that and still be at work, and how that affected us. And it was really powerful, and it was a great way of really connecting that team together. And again, we choose. We can continue and just go straight into work mode and do that work, which is really important and powerful, or we can actually say we're going to be an organization where we, again, are putting the relationships of the people, sharing power, giving folks a voice in ways that matter, and really live that in our work.
Somebody else asked, where else does or can inclusion manifest itself outside of hiring? And I think if I'm remembering right, that perfectly goes into what you're going to talk about next.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide.
But we do have many more questions, and hopefully we'll have some more time for questions at the end too. So please keep leaving your questions and comments here, and we'll have some time after these next few slides to dig into some more of this.
Yeah. So how do you support a culture of inclusion? And I think this goes to what you were talking about, Bridget. You get uncomfortable, right? You welcome discomfort as much as you can. You understand that it's the root of all growth. You don't take everything personally, and this is really difficult. So to do this work as an organization, you will all have to do this work as individuals, right? That's just the reality. It will bring up all kinds of stuff for you as individuals, and you've got to be able to do your own work and sit at the tables and have these conversations. Right? Deepen your own political analysis of racism and oppression so that you understand really how complex the issue really is. I say all the time, what keeps us small, what keeps us is we don't want to be uncomfortable, not for 1 minute of one day. But if you build a culture, if you say, as a company, as an organization, we will question and we will learn and we will discuss and we will be uncomfortable and we will still be okay, that's a powerful piece of organizational culture that you can move forward with. Next slide. Develop a culture of appreciation, right? So this is really important. It's just where organization takes time and makes sure that people, work, and efforts are appreciated, right? That you are that learning organization, where it's okay to make mistakes and mistakes are seen as learning. And where leadership says, you know what, we know it's going to take longer to do this work. We're going to deal with the funders. We're going to have these difficult conversations with the stakeholders, and we're going to actually take the time and do this well. And where leadership identifies what's right as well as what's wrong within its doors. Next slide. Share power, right? Where does power sit? How is power understood within your organization? Who has it? How is it utilized? How is it shared? The great thing about white privilege, and I don't know who said this, but I really need to find out, is I heard it said once, no matter how much you have, you never lose it. It never goes away. So you can share it all day long.
I love that.
You can stand on street corners and give it out. You still have it. You will never lose it. So learn how to be a good ally and share the power that you have within your organization with people who don't, with people who are marginalized.
And I think, right, in thinking about that statement, I think what I hear from a lot of people when I talk about the work that we're doing at C3, it's really focused on diversity and inclusion, or even when I was doing research to help us, think about how do we do this the right way. I think what a lot of people, particularly well-meaning white people, bump up against is they hear someone say, well, you just need to share your power, or, you need to check your privilege. I think a lot of people feel like, okay, that's great, but how do I actually do that? And I guess in my perspective, I feel like there are really some tactical things that you can do just as an individual. I think one is just doing this research on your own and exploring. I mean, you all being here today, I think, for those of you who are white people within predominantly white organizations and are looking to really dismantle the systemic racism within your organization, I think this in itself is a piece of that effort. And I think in addition to that, I don't know, I could go on. We're going to have another webinar where we talk specifically about white people within predominantly white organizations and how they can dismantle the racism there. But I think there are just, I wouldn't feel stopped by the idea of I don't know what it means to, share my white privilege. I think people know, but trip themselves up because it takes time and effort. So I would just say, don't be afraid to take the time and make the effort. One of the best things that I heard in doing research about this from a woman named Jessica Bird at another, it's another agency for progressive politicians called 3 Point Strategies. She is talking about hiring more people of color, particularly women of color, within progressive institutions, and she said that there's time if it's in your values, and that feels like it's totally been my North Star through this whole process. Is that if it's in the values of your company, you can make time for it. And I think even for small businesses, even for nonprofits where budgets are really, really stretched, if it's something that's in your values, you got time for it. Other things are less important. You got to look at your priorities and think, what else is on this scale? And
if it's in your values, you put money behind it, you resource it, you build it into your planning. Yeah. It touches every level. And I love when organizations just have a conversation around what does good leadership look like, and how are we defining what a good leader is, and what are those skills that we talk about with a good leader. Because that's what we're talking about, is sharing power, right? Who's at the table, but more importantly, who wasn't even invited in the room, and why not? Organizations, like humans, we have a lifespan and a life cycle. And we hit maturity and we have a choice. And our choice are two things. We will either evolve or we will decline. This here is shared power. This work that we're talking about, that's the evolution of what your organization is. If you don't evolve, you will decline. That is nature. This is our work.
Mm-hmm.
This is our work. Next slide.
All right.
Oh, questions. Yay.
Okay, so we have a bunch of them in here, questions and comments. So let me just go through some of these. One thing that someone said earlier when we were talking about encouraging being uncomfortable, and please, as I'm going through some of these, we have about 10 more minutes here. So if you do have any specific questions or comments, please leave them here and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. Something that someone said earlier when we were talking about the benefits of being uncomfortable in your organization, I like this comment, is that there's a program called Systemic Innovative Thinking that challenges you to say, if it ain't broke, break it. And I feel like that's a great motto for organizations that are a little too comfortable.
Yeah. We all, I always tell people, whether I'm working with organizations or individuals, comfort is a killer. It kills innovation. There's a reason that we sit on the couch and watch 300 channels, right? It breaks us. And so we have got to constantly push ourselves. We have to evolve or we go into decline. And we don't grow, you don't learn, and be comfortable. Like, you can't do those two things at the same time. You can't be a growing, learning organization and be comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Someone asked, she said, as far as race and religion, we have a more diverse team than anywhere I've worked. I perceive us to be somewhat, perhaps very ageist and ableist because we have fewer older folks and no one visibly disabled. Do you have tips on how we can do better in those areas?
Yeah, I think, again, it's building the relationships with the communities and, again, maybe offering what kind of services, what can you offer that can be of support to those communities where then you can start building real relationships with them. Like, it's like dating, right? Like, you want to test each other out and you want to then really invest some long-term roots in certain areas. And the thing about it is you want these relationships before you need these communities. Because we've all been at the place where we're like, oh, we really need to be over here talking to these folks, but nobody knows anybody over there. Mm-hmm. We have zero relationship with them. Relationship building, community building is a key strategy to your long term. And again, it's one of the things where we're like, oh, we don't want to invest the time and energy into that until you need it, and it's not there. So there's a small organization that I was working with that had a crisis. It was a really bad crisis, and they had no relationship with the Black community in the city, none, and it was some things that went down. And in talking with them, I said, the choices you made weren't bad choices. I said, your real lesson here is, why didn't you have any relationship with the Black community in this town? How come now any rumor about you is believable? Because you have somebody that you've worked with that can stand up and say, oh, that's not true. Mm-hmm. You need those relationships before the crisis occurs. They should be transformational, never transactional.
Absolutely.
And you have to be okay to go into a community and for that community to say to you, no, thank you. We actually don't want to work with you. And they have every right to say that because they've been burned in the past. And that's reality.
I think when you talk about building relationships too, just on a very tactical level, some things that we've been doing as a company to build more relationships, particularly with people of color within our industry, is basically going out and actually being in places where there are more people of color. So getting out of our own existing networks and our own organizations.
Mm-hmm.
I know for me as an individual, I mean, I go to a lot of, networking events in Chicago, and I've stopped going to the events that I know are going to be all white ladies there. Um,
Yeah.
is that it's not it's not as engaging of a conversation and not as worth my time. And
And
I've
so
been
one tip that I do, Bridget,
yeah,
is I've been doing 100 and 200 conversations. So I've been asking folks to introduce me to new people, right?
mm-hmm.
And just having simple conversations with them. Who are you? What do you do? What does that look like? Oh, let me, how can I be a bridge and help you? Who can I introduce you to? But just me, I literally have a goal this year of talking to 200 new people.
Oh, I love that.
And because that's how you actually start to build the relationships. That's how you expand your network. And when you talk about expanding your network, there's things that come with that: exposure, opportunity, and income.
Absolutely. Which are all things that we all want more of.
Which are all things that I don't know any organization does not want more of.
Mm-hmm. Something that our CEO has been doing is actually just going through his LinkedIn networks and making connections with more people of color and emailing them and just checking in, doing exactly what you're doing, Desiree, just checking in about their work, not with a specific ask, just to get to know them and who they are.
Yep.
And I feel like that's something that's so simple, doesn't take a lot of time, doesn't take any money, and it's helping him to diversify his network in a really meaningful way. Because I think what we see reaffirmed in hiring processes across organizations over and over again is that when it's time to hire, we look at the people around us, we ask our friends and our colleagues, and a lot of times those friends and colleagues look like us, and they share with us great people who also look like us, and it reaffirms this system. And so that feels
and
like
there has to be
meaningful.
intentionality. None of this work happens without intentionality.
Mm-hmm.
None of it happens without intentionality. And so you're absolutely right. Again, I build into my weeks that I'm going to have X amount of conversation over the next couple of weeks with X many people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is there any last comment or question before we wrap up? This hour has flown by.
I know, it really has. Let's see. Can you share more specific examples that leadership staff have done? Oh, she said she liked the LinkedIn example. Thank you. More specific examples of that leadership or staff have done to help recruitment and create inclusion. Desiree, I feel like you have way more experience in this area than I do. I know you do.
So one thing that I work with a lot of environmental groups, and we all know you don't get any more white than some of those do. And so one of the things I'm like, so do you know all of the science and engineering teachers at your local or nearby HBCUs, right?
Mm.
And they're like, no. And I'm like, so you have black colleges which are raising, which are graduating black engineers, black scientists, and you don't know who these folks are, who the teachers are, so that you have access to meeting some of these students. Why aren't you going and talking into these classrooms? Why aren't you connecting? Another thing that I really, really emphasize is if you're talking about folks coming straight out of college, you must offer paid internships. You cannot offer not paid internships because you are saying to a whole swatch of young people who can't afford to work for you for free that they don't get that work experience. I worked at a summer camp for years where we grew our own staff. We invested in the programming to make sure that we were getting kids of color coming out of high school, that we worked with them and stayed in touch all summer, that then they came back and worked for us over the summers. And then when they hit 18, we had staff. And we had diverse staff. And they were reflective of the kids that we served. And so it is that kind of thinking and intentionality around your programming, that will get you what you need. But again, that's a long-term play, and people want instant friendships, and that's actually not how life is.
That is such a great point and a fantastic note to end on, since we're just I want to thank everyone for being here today and being a part of this uncomfortable conversation with us. I hope it's giving you some inspiration that you can take back to your organizations. We'll be sending out the recording and the slides for this webinar after. And we have 2 more webinars coming up in this series. And Desiree does this work all the time with organizations just like yours.
Yeah.
And would love to work with some of your organizations who are really serious about making this commitment to this work. And so we'll include more information in that follow-up email about how to connect with her and work with her.
Yeah, and I work with everyone from senior leaders to come in and helping you actually learn how to have difficult conversations and to facilitate difficult conversations for you. But I love social media, and so please find me at Desiree Adaway on Twitter, and beyond today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Desiree.
Thank you all. Have a good one.
All right. Bye-bye.